Welcome to Blurr. In the shadows of ordinary life lived a man hiding unimaginable darkness. Jeffrey Dahmer seemed quiet, almost invisible, but behind closed doors, his crimes shocked the world. Between 1978 and 1991, his story exposed a chilling mix of manipulation, isolation, and obsession. This isn't just about violence, it's about the mind behind it. Before we continue, like the video, subscribe to Blurr, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Because some truths are darker than fiction and far more real. You are about to hear the full story of one of the most disturbing and psychologically complex criminal cases in American history. This is the story of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a man whose crimes shocked the world, forced a reckoning with how society identifies and fails troubled individuals, and left wounds in communities that have never fully healed. Chapter 1. The Boy from Bath. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first child of Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a chemistry student, and Joyce Annette Flint, a teletype machine instructor. By most outward measures, the Dahmers were an ordinary Midwestern family navigating the American dream: education, work, a home, children. But inside the walls of the Dahmer household, things were rarely as they appeared. Joyce Dahmer suffered from profound mental illness, depression, anxiety, and erratic emotional instability. Her pregnancies were difficult, and she used medication heavily during the time she carried Jeffrey. Whether those medications affected his development is a question that would later occupy researchers and defense attorneys alike. But it remains unanswered. Lionel Dahmer, by his own admission in his memoir, was frequently absent, physically present but emotionally unavailable, buried in his studies and work, struggling to manage his wife's volatile episodes. The home was often loud with arguments, tension thick enough to suffocate. As a toddler and young child, Jeffrey was described by family as happy, energetic, and engaged. He laughed easily. He was curious. He chased fireflies. Then something shifted. When Jeffrey was around 6 years old, a surgery to correct a double hernia seemed, in his own later recollections, to mark a turning point. He became withdrawn, quieter, more detached. Whether the surgery itself, or the hospitalization, or simply the natural arc of his developing psychology was responsible, no one can say for certain. What is clear is that the boy who emerged from early childhood was different from the one who had entered it. The family moved to Bath Township, Ohio in 1968. When Jeffrey was 8, Lionel had taken a position as a research chemist at PPG Industries. They settled into a modest ranch house on West Bath Road, surrounded by woods, set back from the road. It was set back from the road. Isolated, quiet, perhaps too quiet for a child who was already beginning to retreat inward. In Bath, Jeffrey Dahmer developed his first known compulsive behavior, a fascination with dead animals. He began collecting bones. It started, innocuously enough, as childhood curiosity often does. He was fascinated by the way animal carcasses looked, how bones fit together, what lay beneath the surface of living thing. He began dissecting dead animals he found near the house. Roadkill, animals that had died in the yard. His father, a chemist, occasionally showed him how to strip the flesh from small creatures using chemical bleach. Lionel has said he thought he was encouraging a scientific mind. Jeffrey kept jars of insects. He preserved specimens. He rode his bike to the drainage ditches and collected whatever dead things he could find. He called these creatures his little friends. He kept their bones in buckets behind the house, hidden from his parents. Neighbors noticed he was quiet. Teachers called him a loner. He had no close friends. He had a dry, sardonic wit when he bothered to use it, but mostly he drifted through social situations like a ghost, watching, not participating. His home life continued to deteriorate. Lionel and Joyce's marriage collapsed in a spectacular storm of accusations, counter-accusations, and competing lawyers. When the divorce was finalized in 1978, both parents essentially abandoned Jeffrey. Joyce took his younger brother David and moved away without warning. Lionel, already living elsewhere with his new girlfriend Shari, did not immediately realize his 18-year-old son had been left entirely alone in the bathhouse. Jeffrey Dahmer was alone in that house for weeks. He had no money, no food, no guidance. And in those weeks of isolation and silence in that house in the Ohio woods, something that had long been building inside him broke open. He was 18 years old, and he was about to commit his first murder. Chapter 2. The first, his name was Stephen Mark Hicks. He was 19 years old. He had long brown hair, a wide smile, the easy confidence of a young man who had places to be and people who loved him. On June 18, 1978, 3 weeks after Jeffrey Dahmer's high school graduation, Stephen Hicks was hitchhiking along the highway near Bath, Ohio, heading to a friend's party. Stephen, he stopped. He offered Stephen a ride, and then invited him back to the house for beer. Stephen agreed. It seemed harmless enough. A beer, maybe a few hours, then on to the party. Jeffrey had some records. It was a hot afternoon. They drank together. They talked. Jeffrey later described feeling a powerful surge of something he couldn't name, desire, desperation, need, the terror of being alone again. He did not want Stephen to leave. When Stephen said it was time to go, Jeffrey picked up a barbell and struck him from behind. Then he strangled him with the barbell. Stephen Hicks died in the living room of the Dahmer house in Bath, Ohio. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old. It was his first murder, and what he did next revealed the particular horror of what he was becoming. He dragged the body to the crawl space beneath the house. He left it there for a week. Then he dissected it, the way he had learned to dissect the small animals from the woods. He stripped the flesh. He dissolved it with acid. He pulverized the bones and scattered them in the woods behind the property. When it was done, there was almost nothing left of Stephen Hicks. Jeffrey Dahmer then went about his life for 9 years without killing again. He enrolled briefly at Ohio State University but dropped out after 1 semester, drinking heavily. His father, horrified by his son's alcoholism, enrolled him in the Army. Jeffrey served 3 years, stationed 3 years, stationed in Germany before being discharged for excessive drinking. He returned briefly to Ohio, stayed with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, was arrested for indecent exposure and disorderly conduct, and eventually moved to Milwaukee. 9-year gap between the first and second murder has fascinated criminologists. How does a person commit such an act, then stop for nearly a decade? Some suggest that the isolation, the opportunity, and the particular circumstances of 1978 were never replicated. Others point to the Army, the structure, the movement, the constant presence of others, as a form of containment. Others note simply that Jeffrey Dahmer was functional enough to suppress what was inside him, channeling it into alcohol, into fantasy, into the marginal but legal outlets available to him. But the fantasy never went away. He has described dreaming of having a companion who could not leave, of someone who would be there when he woke up, forever, of control, of silence, of possession. In Milwaukee, living in a rooming house, then in an apartment with his grandmother, then alone, Jeffrey Dahmer began visiting gay bathhouses, gay bars, the margins of the city's nightlife. He was quiet, polite, handsome, in a pale, expressionless way. Men noticed him. And then, in September 1987, 9 years after the death of Stephen Hicks, 9 years after the death of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. His name was Stephen Tuomi. He was 24. They met at a bar. They took a room at the Ambassador Hotel. Jeffrey later claimed he did not remember killing Stephen Tuomi, that he woke the next morning and the man was dead. He bought a large suitcase. He packed the body inside. He took a taxi to his grandmother's house. He kept Stephen Tuomi's body in the basement for 2 weeks. Then he disposed of it the same way he had disposed of Stephen Hicks 9 years before. The machinery had started again. This time, it would not stop. Chapter 3. Escalation. After Stephen Tuomi, the murders accelerated. Not immediately. Jeffrey Dahmer could still go months between killings. But the intervals were shrinking, the compulsion growing stronger, the control he once exercised over it weakening like a rope fraying at the center. January 1988. James Dockstader, 14 years old, was killed at Jeffrey's grandmother's home in West Dallas. He met James outside a gay bar. He offered him money. He strangled him. He dismembered and disposed of the body using the methods he had refined over the years: acid, the drain, scattered remains. March 1988. Richard Guerrero, 25 years old, same pattern. Jeffrey lured him with the promise of money in exchange for companionship, took him home, killed him, dissolved his remains. His grandmother, an elderly and religious woman, noticed strange smells coming from the basement. She found chemicals she didn't understand. She told Lionel. Lionel was concerned but not alarmed enough. Jeffrey explained the smells away. He was charming when he needed to be, plausible, deferential to his grandmother. She loved him. She loved him. Believed him. In September 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's home and into an apartment on North 24th Street in Milwaukee. He was asked to leave after he was arrested for drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Samzak Sinthasamphone. He gave the boy a drink laced with a sedative. He fondled him. The boy escaped and told his family. His family called the police. A child for immoral purposes. He was sentenced to 1 year in a work-release program and 5 years of probation. He served 10 months. During his sentencing hearing, he told the judge, "I am an alcoholic and a person who has unfortunately been engaged in a temporary but very perverse phase in my life. Temporary, very perverse phase. While still under probation, while still checking in with his probation officer, while still within the oversight of the system." Jeffrey Dahmer returned to his apartment at 924 North 25th Street and resumed killing. Anthony Sears, 24 years old, was killed in March 1989. He was a restaurant manager. He met Jeffrey at a bar the night before Easter. He was the first victim whose skull Jeffrey kept. He boiled the skull and painted it, keeping it as a trophy. A keepsake, something to hold. This was new. The preservation was becoming more elaborate, more deliberate, more ritualistic. Jeffrey later explained that he was terrified of being alone. The skulls and the preserved remains were company. They were his. They could not leave. He continued to meet with his probation officer. He worked at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. He paid his rent. He was quiet. He was quiet. Unremarkable, the kind of person neighbors describe as nice enough but kept to himself. Nobody looked too closely. Chapter 4. 213 Oxford Apartments. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street. In the North Side neighborhood of Milwaukee. He would live there for a little over a year. In that time, he would kill 12 people. The apartment was small: a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom. Neighbors complained about the smell repeatedly to the building manager. Jeffrey told them it was rotting meat, a broken freezer, a problem he was dealing with. The manager passed along the complaints but did not investigate further. Bedroom closet. Jeffrey Dahmer kept a 57-gallon blue barrel of acid in the refrigerator. He stored body parts he was not yet ready to dispose of. On a shelf in the bedroom, he arranged a collection of skulls. In the kitchen, he kept chemicals and tools. In the freezer, in carefully wrapped packages, he kept flesh. He had, by this point, developed a particular method. He would meet men, usually black or Latino men, in bars or on the street or near bus stops, and offer them money, sometimes as little as $50, to come back to his apartment and pose for photographs, or just to spend time together. He would give them a drink into which he had dissolved sleeping pills. When they were sedated, he strangled them. Then he took photographs of the body in various positions. He wanted to remember, to preserve the moment of complete possession. Then he dismembered them, disposed of the viscera in garbage bags left in the building's dumpster, and kept what he wanted to keep. He ate parts of some of his victims. He has said it made him feel closer to them, more connected, that they became a part of him, that they could not leave. Between June 1990 and July 1991, 13 months. Killed 12 men in that apartment. Ricky Beeks, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Connor Axinthesamphon, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Bradehoft, and more. They were weird young men, most of them. Many were from Milwaukee's black community, a detail that would later become a flashpoint of outrage when it emerged how many times police had encountered warning signs and looked away. The most devastating example occurred on May 27, 1991. Connor Axinthesamphon, the younger brother of the boy Jeffrey had assaulted in 1988, was found stumbling, naked and disoriented, on the street outside the Oxford Apartments. He was 14 years old. He had been drugged. Two young women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, found Conorak and called 911. They told the dispatcher the boy was bleeding, that he was confused, that he needed help. When police officers John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived, Jeffrey Dahmer was also there. He was calm. He spoke to the officers. He told them Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they'd had a domestic argument, that he'd had too much to drink. He showed them, he claimed, a photo of Conorak in the apartment, though what photo he showed them remains disputed. The officers believed him. Police again from a phone across the street, they were told the situation had been handled. Within an hour, Conorak Axinthesamphon was dead. The two officers later joked about the situation on their police radio. When the recording was later revealed, it caused an eruption of community rage. The officers were fired. They were later reinstated. The city of Milwaukee, particularly its black community, would never forgive what had happened at that street corner on that May night. It was not merely a failure of one officer or one call. It was the visible crystallization of who gets believed, who gets protected, whose life is treated as worth investigating. Chapter 5. The night it ended. July 22, 1991. A Monday night, hot and humid in Milwaukee, as summer nights there often are. Tracy Edwards was 32 years old. He had come to Milwaukee from Mississippi. He met Jeffrey Dahmer near a mall, and Jeffrey offered to pay him to come back to his apartment and pose for photographs. Tracy agreed. At the apartment, things quickly felt wrong. Jeffrey was strange, agitated, muttering. He handcuffed Tracy's left wrist. He produced a large butcher knife. He held it against Tracy's chest. He told Tracy he was going to eat his heart. Tracy Edwards kept his head for 3 hours. 3 hours. He talked to Jeffrey, stayed calm, waited for an opportunity. He complimented Jeffrey's apartment. He pretended to be interested in whatever Jeffrey was watching on television. He kept him talking. When Jeffrey was momentarily distracted, Tracy punched him in the face, pushed him away, and ran out the door. He ran into the street and flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller. He was handcuffed. He had a knife. He was in a state of extreme distress. He told them what had happened. He took them back to apartment 213. Jeffrey Dahmer opened the door. The officers asked about the handcuff key. Jeffrey resisted. One officer went to the bedroom to look for the key. What he found instead ended the investigation immediately. Photographs. Dozens of Polaroid photographs of bodies, dismembered bodies, bodies in various stages of decomposition, arranged in poses. The skull collection. The smell, now impossible to ignore. The officer shouted for his partner to restrain Dahmer. He did so. When police opened the refrigerator, they found a human head. When they looked further, they found human hearts, portions of muscle tissue intended for consumption. 3 more heads in the freezer, hands, penises in a stockpot, and a 57-gallon barrel of acid containing dissolving human remains. Jeffrey Dahmer did not resist arrest. He said, "I don't want any more of this. I want it all to end." 17 victims. 15 in Wisconsin, 2 in Ohio, 13 at the Oxford apartments alone. The murders spanned 13 years, from 1978 to 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer was 31 years old. Milwaukee came undone. Chapter 6. The Victim. Before we continue with the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, his arrest, must stop here. We must do what true crime so often fails to do. We must speak about the people he killed, because Jeffrey Dahmer's story has been told many times. The names of his victims have not always been. Stephen Mark Hicks was 19 years old. He played guitar. He was hitchhiking to a party. He had a family who searched for him for years and never knew what had happened to him until Dahmer's confession. Stephen Walter Toomey was 24 years old. He was from Michigan. He enjoyed being outdoors. His family held on to hope for a long time. James Edward Dockstader was 14 years old. He was of Native American and white ancestry. He had run away from home, as teenagers sometimes do, and was vulnerable in the way that runaways are vulnerable. He was a child. Richard Guerrero was 25 years old. He was of Mexican descent. He had a family who loved him and mourned him. His sister, Janie, became an advocate for victims' families in the aftermath of the case. Anthony Lee Sears was 24 years old. He was a restaurant manager with aspirations and a future. He met Jeffrey Dahmer on Easter weekend. Raymond Lamont Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, was 33 years old. He was a sex worker. His life was difficult. It was still his life. Edward Warren Smith was 27 years old. He wore a turquoise ring. Jeffrey Dahmer kept that ring for years. Ernest Marquez Miller was 22 years old. Marquez Miller was 22 years old. A student at a dance college. He was thin and athletic and had his whole career in front of him. David Courtney Thomas was 23 years old. He was a father. Curtis Durrell Strotter was 18 years old. He was a model who had done work in Chicago and Milwaukee. He had plans. Errol Lindsay was 19 years old. He went to get his hair done. He never came home. His sister, Rita Isbell, would give one of the most devastating victim impact statements ever recorded in an American courtroom. Anthony Tony Hughes was 31 years old and deaf. He communicated with Jeffrey Dahmer through written notes. He trusted him. Conorak Syntha Soundphone was 14 years old. He was the younger brother of the boy Jeffrey had assaulted years before he was a child. The police sent him back. Matt Cleveland Turner was 20 years old, and Jeffrey spent 2 days together before Jeffrey killed him. He was alive for 2 of those days. Oliver Joseph Lacey was 23 years old. He was described by friends as playful, warm, easy to laugh with. He was a father. Joseph Arthur Radahoff was 25 years old. He was from Illinois. He was looking for work. He had 3 children, 17 lives, 17 futures that ended in that apartment or in Bath, Ohio, or in a Milwaukee hotel room. 17 families who carried the particular, grinding grief of the missing and the murdered. The average age of Dahmer's victims was 23 years old. The majority were men of color. Most were gay or bisexual. Many were already marginalized by poverty, by addiction, by the particular vulnerability that comes from living on the edges of the visible world. They were not statistics. They were not props in someone else's story. They were people. And they deserved so much more than they were given by Jeffrey Dahmer and, in many cases, by the systems that should have protected them. Chapter 7, Confession. After his arrest on the night of July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was cooperative to a degree that stunned investigators. He did not lawyer up immediately. He did not deflect or deny. He sat across the table from detectives, and he talked. He confessed to all 17 murders. He described each one in methodical, sometimes eerily casual detail, the locations, the methods, what he did afterward, what he kept, what he ate, what he was thinking at the time. Detective Dennis Murphy and his colleagues conducted hours of interviews. Jeffrey Dahmer was calm. He answered questions. He said he felt relieved that it was over. He said the compulsion had been getting worse, that he had been accelerating, that he didn't know how much longer he could have kept the secret. He described in clinical language the evolution of his fantasies, from early of his fantasies. Childhood. He had been drawn to the idea of complete control, a companion who could never leave. By the time he reached adulthood, the fantasy had incorporated death. He had fantasized about necrophilia from his early teens. He had tried, unsuccessfully, to dig up a recently buried male corpse when he was a teenager. The fantasy of having someone completely, permanently, had fused with the fantasy of killing. He also described something more disturbing: his attempts to create zombies. He drilled small holes into the skulls of several living victims and injected muriatic acid into their brains, attempting to induce a state of permanent sedation, a living body with no will, no consciousness of its own. Someone who would stay. He was never successful. The victims died. He later said that what he had done was wrong, and he had known it was wrong, which is why he had tried to conceal it. The confession produced a detailed map of his crimes that allowed investigators to verify evidence, identify victims, and provide families with answers. It was also deeply disturbing reading, a document of a mind that had traveled very far from anything recognizable as empathy, operating by a logic that was entirely its own. There was one detail from the confession that has stayed with many who have studied the case. When asked why he had not stopped, why, after the first murder, he had continued, Jeffrey Dahmer said, "I couldn't stop myself." 3 words, an entire world of failure, his own and the world's around him. The police also began the grim work of identifying his victims. Some were identified quickly through missing persons reports. Others took longer. The condition of the remains made identification difficult. DNA testing, still relatively new at the time, was used extensively. Some remains were never definitively matched. Milwaukee's medical examiner worked alongside FBI forensic experts. The blue barrel of acid yielded fragmentary remains of multiple victims. The photographs Dahmer had taken of each victim, his meticulous, obsessive documentation, became key to understanding the timeline and matching remains to names. Milwaukee was simultaneously horrified, riveted, and grieving. The city's black community was not only grieving the murdered men but seething over the failures of the police. The many times neighbors had called about the smell the night they had returned Conorak. Cynthia phoned to the apartment. The general sense that these men's lives had been treated as disposable. When members of Dahmer's victims' families appeared on television, the question was not just what Jeffrey Dahmer had done. The question was what? Who had allowed it to happen for so long? Chapter 8, The Trial. The trial of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee County Circuit Court, before Judge Lawrence Graham. Because Dahmer had confessed to all 17 murders, the question of whether he had committed them was not in dispute. The only question before the jury was whether he was legally insane at the time of the crimes. This was the entire structure of the defense, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, that Jeffrey Dahmer suffered from a mental disease or defect that rendered him unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, that he was, in the clinical sense, out of control, compelled, not responsible in the way that the law requires. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael McCann, countered that Dahmer was calculating, cunning, and deliberate, that the careful selection of victims, the maintenance of his job, the concealment of evidence over 13 years, the luring of men with money and promises, all of it demonstrated not a man in the grip of uncontrollable insanity, but a predator who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. A parade of expert witnesses took the stand. For the defense, psychiatrists and psychologists who described Dahmer's paraphilias, necrophilia, partialism, and argued they constituted a mental disorder that robbed him of the capacity for self-control. For the prosecution, equally credentialed experts who testified that Dahmer's ability to function in society, hold employment, evade detection for over a decade, and carefully destroy evidence demonstrated that he was legally sane. The Milwaukee community watched. Victims' families filled the courtroom. Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, lunged at Dahmer during her victim impact statement. She screamed that she wanted him dead. She had to be restrained. The moment was caught on camera and has been replayed countless times since, not as spectacle, but as a raw and unfiltered expression of what it is to lose a brother to a man who looked him in the eyes. The jury deliberated for about 5 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 15 counts brought to trial in Wisconsin, saying on all counts, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years. He expressed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. He later told reporters that he had wanted to be found guilty, that he wanted to be held responsible, that he did not want to go to a mental institution where he might eventually be released. He said, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done in Ohio." He was later convicted of the murder of Stephen Hicks and sentenced to an additional 15 years. He would serve barely 2. Chapter 9, Inside Prison, and the End. Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. For the first year, he was kept in administrative segregation, isolated from the general population for his own safety. His name was well known among inmates. The nature of his crimes made him a target. In 1993, he requested to be moved to the general prison population. He wanted interaction. He wanted to attend chapel services. He had, during his time in prison, undergone a significant religious conversion. He was baptized as a Christian in May 1994, immersed in a whirlpool by a Church of Christ minister named Roy Ratcliffe, who visited him regularly and later wrote about their conversations. Dahmer told Ratcliffe he had come to believe in God, to acknowledge the horror of what he had done, and to seek meaning in his remaining years. Whether this conversion was sincere or strategic, or some mixture of both, is something only Jeffrey Dahmer could have answered. Ratcliffe believed it was genuine. Others were skeptical. The families of victims were, for the most part, not moved. He also began communicating with Lionel Dahmer, who visited him in prison and later published a memoir called A Father's Story, attempting to understand, through the lens of parenthood and regret, how his son had become what he became. The book is uncomfortable reading, not because of what Lionel says, but because of what he doesn't say, the gaps between the lines, the grief of a parent who will never have an answer sufficient to the question. Inside the prison, Jeffrey Dahmer worked. He mopped floors. He attended church. He wrote letters. He was, by all accounts, quiet, cooperative, easy to manage. He did not attempt to escape. He did not cause disciplinary problems. He was in prison, the model inmate, which is perhaps its own kind of unsettling. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to a work detail in the gymnasium of the prison along with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. They were briefly left unsupervised. Christopher Scarver, who was in prison for murder and had expressed on prior occasions his awareness of and contempt for what Dahmer had done, attacked Jeffrey Dahmer with a 20-inch metal bar from a weight machine. He also attacked Jesse Anderson. Both Dahmer and Anderson were found severely beaten. Jeffrey Dahmer was rushed to a hospital. He was pronounced dead. Approximately 1 hour later, he was 34 years old. Christopher Scarver later said that he had confronted Dahmer with a newspaper clipping about his crimes. He said Dahmer had been unapologetic. He said he felt no remorse for what he had done. Whether this account is entirely accurate, only Scarver knows. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was dead. He had spent 3 years, 4 months, and 3 days in prison. Chapter 10. Aftermath and Reckoning. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer did not end with his death. In some ways, it was only beginning, not as a story of horror, but as a story of consequence and reckoning. Demolished in November 1992, residents who had lived there wanted it gone. The owners wanted it gone. The city wanted the physical reminder erased in its place. An empty lot sat for years, overgrown, unremarkable. A small piece of Milwaukee that the city did not quite know what to do with. The question of how Jeffrey Dahmer had been able to operate for so long, 13 years, 17 murders, became the subject of sustained investigation, journalism, and community grief. Milwaukee Police Department faced a formal review. The handling of the Konarak-Sinta-Samphone incident drew the most scrutiny. Officers Balcerzak and Gabrish were fired, fought their terminations, and were reinstated by an arbitration board. 1994, a decision that re-inflamed community outrage. Balcerzak would later, years after his reinstatement, be elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association. Neighbors of the Oxford apartments, many of them black residents, describe years of calling in complaints about the smell, the noises, the general wrongness emanating from apartment 213. They described being ignored. They described the specific experience of knowing that the system would not take seriously what they were reporting because of who they were, where they lived, who lived near them. Researchers, criminologists, and trauma specialists have spent decades analyzing the case. Several themes recur. The first is the role of isolation and neglect in early development. Dahmer's childhood, the parental conflict, the abandonment, the absence of consistent emotional connection did not make him a murderer. Many people endure worse and become warm, functional human beings. But the absence of human beings, intervention, the failure to recognize and address his increasingly worrying behaviors, the animal dissection, the alcohol, the withdrawal, meant that whatever darkness was developing inside him had no counterforce, no check, no early disruption. The second is the role of systemic racism in who gets protected. The majority of Dahmer's victims were men of color. The police response to community reports, the return of Konarak to the apartment, the general pace at which authorities treated the disappearances of men from marginalized communities. All of this reflects something broader and uglier about whose disappearance is treated as an emergency, and whose is treated as an emergency, and whose is treated as an inconvenience. The third is the question of mental illness and criminal responsibility. The legal system determined Jeffrey Dahmer was sane. Most psychiatric opinion affirms that he suffered from severe paraphilic disorders. The gap between legal sanity and clinical disorder is wide, and the Dahmer case sits squarely in that gap, neither fully explained by one nor fully captured by the other. The families of the victims have carried their grief for decades now. Some have spoken publicly. Some have organized. Some have chosen silence. Rita Isbell, whose outburst in the courtroom became iconic, has been clear in her feelings about the ongoing entertainment industry fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer. When Netflix released a dramatized series about him in 2022, she was not consulted. She spoke publicly about being re-traumatized by seeing her courtroom statement recreated for entertainment, without anyone asking her permission, without any financial compensation. This is perhaps the deepest and most persistent failure attached to the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the tendency to use the case as material for entertainment, for true crime content, for the examination of a single extraordinary killer, while the 17 people he murdered and their families recede into background, into footnote, into the margin of someone else's story. Their names deserve more than margins. Chapter 11. Understanding the Psychology. How does a person become Jeffrey Dahmer? It is a question that has no single, clean answer, which is itself an important thing to understand. The human desire for a clear cause and effect explanation of evil is understandable. If we can identify the precise moment, the specific trauma, the exact neurological defect that made Jeffrey Dahmer what he was, then we can perhaps believe that we can screen for it, prevent it, catch it next time. But the truth is more complicated. Forensic psychologists who have analyzed the case point to a constellation of factors, none of which individually would have been sufficient, but which together may have created conditions in which something deeply pathological took root. First, genetic predisposition. Lionel Dahmer has described his own family history and his wife Joyce's as including significant mental illness. Whether Jeffrey Dahmer inherited a neurological or psychological vulnerability is impossible to prove definitively, but it is consistent with what we understand about the role of genetics in personality disorders and psychiatric conditions. Second, prenatal exposure. Joyce Dahmer used several medications during her pregnancy, including anti-nausea drugs. The long-term neurological effects of prenatal drug exposure in the 1950s and 1960s were not well understood. Whether this contributed to Jeffrey Dahmer's development cannot be established, but it cannot be ruled out. Third, early attachment failure. The relationship between a young child and their primary caregivers is foundational to the development of empathy, emotional regulation, and the capacity for healthy relationships. Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in a household where his parents' marriage was volatile and emotionally unsafe, where his mother was mentally ill and his father was frequently absent. The result, for Jeffrey, appears to have been a profound inability to form genuine emotional connections, to see other people as fully real, as beings with inner lives that mattered. Fourth, the animal dissection behavior. From a forensic psychology standpoint, the ritualistic collection and dissection of dead animals in childhood and adolescence is a recognized warning sign, not in isolation, but as part of a pattern, combined with social isolation, academic underperformance, and increasing withdrawal. Jeffrey Dahmer's adolescent behavior was, in retrospect, a cluster of warning signs that went unaddressed. Fifth, the failure of the healthcare and educational systems. Jeffrey Dahmer saw doctors and counselors at various points in his life. He was in Army-required evaluation. He was in the criminal justice system multiple times. Not one of these encounters produced a serious intervention. He was seen as an alcoholic. He was seen as a troubled young man. He was not seen as what he was. There is also the question of paraphilia, specifically necrophilia, and what psychologists call erotomania, or sexually motivated fantasies involving complete control. Jeffrey Dahmer described his earliest sexual fantasies, which emerged around puberty, as involving a dominant and passive dynamic in which his partner was completely submissive, unresisting. Over time, this fantasy evolved, through his own account, into the idea of a partner who was not merely passive but incapacitated, unconscious, dead. He understood these fantasies were aberrant. He attempted to suppress them. He failed, particularly when alcohol was involved. The paraphilic disorder explanation does not excuse the crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer made choices. He chose to act. He chose to kill. He chose to lure and deceive. But it does push back against the idea that he simply woke up one day and decided to be a monster. Something in the architecture of his mind was built differently, shaped by forces he did not choose, and then, crucially, never interrupted by the forces that might have reshaped it. The question of what have reshaped it could have changed the outcome haunts the case. Earlier intervention, a more attentive parent, a teacher who noticed, a counselor who asked the right questions, a police officer who took the animal bone collection seriously, a different judge who had given him a longer sentence after the 1988 assault. There is no shortage of moments where the trajectory might have bent. It did not bend, and 17 people died. Story, or rather, to the place where a story like this must arrive, not at closure, because there is none, but at reflection. Jeffrey Dahmer died in 1994, but the case he left behind has never stopped generating conversation, analysis, controversy, and, most importantly, grief. He has been the subject of books, documentaries, feature films, dramatized series, podcasts, academic papers, and true crime episodes too numerous to count. His face has appeared on merchandise. His name is recognizable to people who were not yet born when he was arrested. He has become a cultural object, an icon of monstrosity, in ways that are deeply troubling if examined honestly, because the more attention we give to Jeffrey Dahmer, the more we must ask ourselves who we are giving it to, and who we are giving it at the expense of. The victims of Jeffrey Dahmer were largely men of color, many of them gay, many of them poor, many of them living lives that society had already treated as marginal. They were the kind of men whose disappearances did not generate urgent police investigations. They were the kind of men whose families were told to wait and see. They were the kind of men who were walked back into a park 213 by officers who believed the calm white man in the doorway over the bleeding child on the street. When we make Jeffrey Dahmer the center of the story, we are, in some sense, repeating the mistake of the system that allowed him to operate for so long. We are centering the person who was centered in life and pushing to the margins the people who were marginalized in life and in death. There are families still living with this grief. The children of Oliver Lacey are adults now. The children of Oliver Lacey are adults. Siblings of Tony Hughes have grown older, carrying their loss. The parents of Conorak, Sintas, and Fonfone, who had already lost a son to Jeffrey Dahmer's earlier assault, and who watched their second son be returned to his killer by police, endured to his killer by police. Something that has no adequate language. Their stories are the ones that deserve to be told. Their grief is the one that deserves to be witnessed. What should we take from the story of Jeffrey Dahmer? That systems fail, that mental illness, in Dahmer, in his mother, perhaps in the patterns of the family, goes unaddressed until it is catastrophic, that race shapes whose life is treated as worth protecting, that the marginal, the poor, the thief, gay, the wandering, the unloved are always more vulnerable than they should be, that a 14-year-old boy was walked back into a murderer's apartment by the people who were supposed to protect him, that 17 people died in the time it died. It took for someone to finally believe that something was very wrong. What should we carry forward? An insistence on seeing the people who are easy to overlook, an investment in mental health resources, in early intervention, in the kind of attentive community support that might catch what schools and parents and police miss, a commitment to believing the witnesses, particularly those whose testimony is easy to ignore, a refusal to let the names of the dead become footnotes. Stephen, James, Richard, Anthony, Raymond, Edward, Ernest, David, Curtis, Errol, Tony, Conorak, Matt, Jeremy, Oliver, Joseph. Say their names. This has been the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, but it is also, and more importantly, the story of 17 people who deserve to live. who deserve to be found sooner, who deserve to be found sooner. Be believed. This audiobook ends here, but the obligation to remember them, that does not end. Thank you for listening.